Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'rith. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. In this episode, I'm pleased to be in conversation with Dr. Adam Jortner, professor of history at Auburn University and author of A Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom. In his latest book, Dr. Jortner provides a sweeping account of Jewish history during one of the most transformative eras in American history, leading up to, through, and following the revolution. But before we dive into today's conversation, a quick reminder: if you enjoy this program, subscribe to Conversations with B'rith wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to leave us a rating. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for all of our latest content. The story of how Jews during the Revolutionary era sought and celebrated freedom in America and worked to expand the parameters of liberty for all Americans is the focus of A Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom, a new book by Auburn University professor Dr. Adam Jortner. Jews played a vital role in winning the revolution, fighting alongside their Christian counterparts as patriots and helping to shape the new republic. And after the war, they cemented their place in American society, refusing to accept the second-class status imposed on them in many European societies. By pushing for more freedoms, Jews inspired the nation to live up to its founding ideals. And just as their civic lives evolved, so too did Jewish religious life in this transformative period. I'm fortunate to be joined by Professor Jortner today to discuss A Promised Land and his riveting account of Judaism's importance at the dawn of the United States. Professor Jortner is a professor of history at Auburn University and the author of 4 books on American religion. He's also the creator of several Audible series on U.S. history, including The Hidden History of the Boston Tea Party and American Monsters. Adam, thank you for joining me to talk about A Promised Land. Your work highlights an important and often overlooked chapter of American Jewish history, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to be here.
Well, before we delve into the book, A Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Freedom, I'm curious, have you written about this topic before, or is this your first deep dive into early Jewish contributions to American democracy?
Well, I spent the first 15 years of my career working on American Christianity and sort of the ways in which Christianity as an institution functions differently in a democracy than under a monarchy. So I wrote a book about the ways in which conflict with Native Americans changes how American Christians think. I wrote a book about how being in a democracy might change the way people think about what a miracle is and what miracles do in a church. And then I did a deep dive into the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon religion. And in some ways, all of that prepared me to, when I took a look at Judaism, I sort of saw it through institutional eyes, or rather to sort of think about the way that the what's happening to Jews, what's happening to synagogues, very similar to what's happening to the churches, but Judaism is fundamentally different from Christianity. So what happens is sort of it's very similar, but it's really different. And what you really get is the feeling among these Jewish Americans of, we are trying to get to something here that we've never gotten to before, and that they're getting really serious about not just changes to their religion, but also changes to their status to become actual citizens, which hadn't been the case virtually anywhere else.
So how did the Revolutionary War change the political and cultural landscape for Jews in the colonial world, and then the new United States? I mean, there was no game plan. There was no textbook here. It was all from the very beginning. So how did the war change that scene for American Jews at the time? Small population.
Very small population. Again, not a ton of Jews in the early U.S. They're probably, I think, 0.1% of the population. Very, very tiny. It's not that, if the Jews hadn't joined the revolution would have fallen apart. But there are two important things to note. Jews really backed the revolution and volunteered for it. And the other important thing is the American Patriot movement, the pro-independence movement, accepted them as full members. So Jews offered, and folks like Washington and Jefferson accept them. What you get is a situation where the Patriots probably didn't know there were going to be many Jews joining them. But very quickly, American Jews cotton on to the movement, and they say, this is something we're interested in. Congress asks Christian clergymen to give a prayer for peace in 1776. This is before the Declaration. They ask all Christian clergymen to give a prayer of peace and have a day of fasting. But Gershom Satius, who's the leader of New York's Jews, says, I'm going to give one too. He just sort of walks right into it. And in fact, when Washington repeats Congress's order, Washington leaves off the Christian part. So Satius is ready to be a full American patriot the way other people are. And in fact, when the British invade New York, Satius and most of his congregation pick up, grab one of the Torahs, and head off to Connecticut to rather than live under British rule. And Jews volunteer for the army and military service at the same rate as their Gentile neighbors. And that's really important because in Europe, no Jews have a family military tradition. Every European state is connected to a church, so Jews can't be military officers in any European country. In many countries, they're not allowed to serve. Russia allows them to serve, but that means that if they're 12, they might end up in the Russian army. But Washington and the Americans accept the Jews in the army, and they promote them as officers. There isn't going to be a religious qualification to serve as an officer in the U.S. Armed Forces. And that's kind of revolutionary. This idea that Washington really does want to take, eventually throughout the course of the war, realizes he's got to take everyone who comes, and he really does begin to conceive of citizenship as something that goes beyond one's personal religious beliefs to one's political beliefs. And there are other ways in which American Jews sort of get involved in the fight, because, of course, one thing about the British, when the British are ruling the U.S., there are, of course, laws in place that say you've got to be a Christian to hold public office. And when the Americans break those laws and say, well, those laws don't apply anymore, wouldn't you know it? But guys like Mordecai Sheftall in Georgia start showing up and saying, okay, I'm ready to help you guys lead. And he ends up holding these important positions in Savannah that he could not have held under the British regime. So again, it is just, it's not that Jews are the only force that made American freedom happen. It is that Jews saw what was happening, asked to join, and were accepted into this movement. And that really is what changes their status in the U.S. and I think really changes the way the Patriots look at the idea of religion and citizenship.
Well, you referenced Washington, but how do you explain that the founding fathers who came from, they were born here, but came from a British tradition, how do you explain that they broke with that tradition? I'm sure in the family, certain ideas and concepts were handed down, such as it was. So how do you explain the fact that they were as open-minded as they were?
I think the founding, again, when we say, first of all, when you say founding fathers, you could mean anything. If someone says the founding fathers said something, always be suspicious. If they say John Jay said, or if they say George Washington said, then pay greater attention, because the founding fathers are like, anybody. You could find a founding father who says everything.
Well, I'm thinking of some of these exchanges, let's say, between John Adams and Jefferson. These were open-minded people.
They were open-minded guys, didn't like the Talmud very much, didn't really like Judaism very much. Jefferson and Adams are both on record as saying some pretty cruel, unpleasant things about Judaism and about, and not just Judaism, but the entire Jewish tradition. But Jefferson nevertheless appoints Jews to serve in federal office when he's president of the United States. And, again, the John Adams Federalist Party is going to hold a parade to try to get people to pass the Constitution. This is after the war. They're having a parade for the Constitution. They're trying to get people to vote for the U.S. Constitution. In New York, they're going to have a parade. They see it's going to fall on a Jewish holy day. They delay it specifically so that Jews can come. So what I think you have is there are a number of these Federalist leaders, a number of these early leaders of the movement, Washington, Adams, Jefferson are prominent among them, Hamilton, who are able to realize that what they think of Jewish religion is not germane to whether someone is a patriot, which is to say, what you think about God is not necessarily determinative of whether or not you'll make a good citizen. And that's what ultimately, when Washington, when he's president, addresses the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, that's precisely what he says. He says, we do not judge people based on their faith, but only on whether they conduct themselves as a good citizen. So that the goal becomes, what is your conduct, not what is your belief. What are you doing? How do you contribute? Are you a good person? Not who is your father? Who is your mother? Where does, where did your parents worship? Where were they born? This is going to be a shift, and it's a shift for Jews. It's a shift for Catholics. They still have a tough road to hoe. It's a shift for Baptists, who actually, this is very odd. Today, living in Alabama, which is mostly Baptist, but the Baptists face enormous limitations on their freedom in places like Massachusetts and Virginia. The war helps break that because they need the Baptists. They need Baptists to volunteer, and Madison and some other folks are willing to say, okay, I'll tell you what, if you guys will join into the fight, we will suspend these discriminatory rules. And again, Baptists, Catholics, Jews, people who are not of the majority faith, showing through their service that they can be citizens. And I think that's a crucial idea. And it only happens because of the revolution. The Jews are really a test case because they're the only non-Christian group of whites at the time. And it's not just a case of we think this would be a good idea, but of, okay, we need military force to win independence, to secure freedom. And these guys are contributing. This is how we're going to have to start thinking about what a citizen is.
Well, many of us grew up learning about Chaim Solomon, the Jewish patriot who sacrificed his wealth to help fund the American Revolution, only to go on unpaid and largely unrecognized. But is that the full story? Because there were Jewish communities. You referenced Savannah. Where were some of these other large Jewish communities? Philadelphia is where Solomon was, but where else were they living?
Yeah, they're all over. They're predominantly in 5 major cities, but they can be found sort of throughout British North America. So there are synagogues in Newport, Rhode Island, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, South Carolina. There's also a Jewish community in Savannah that doesn't have a synagogue, but is rather prominent there anyway. And something that happens during the war is that of all those cities by 1780, all those cities except Philadelphia are under British control. So Jewish patriots who cannot serve in the army, so men who are too old and Jewish women who are patriots who can make their way to Philadelphia so they can live and worship in a patriot synagogue. And Philadelphia's congregation Mikveh Israel actually reconstitutes itself as it's no longer a Philadelphia-based organization. They recreate itself. They create a new constitution, and they bring in a board that comes from all over the country, people from Savannah, Charleston, New York. They pick Gershom Satius of New York is the Hazan, who's going to lead services. The president is from Philly. It is in some ways one of the first national religious institutions in the United States, and it's Jewish, and again, there aren't any legal objections launched against this idea of there's going to be a free synagogue that is explicitly national, explicitly American in character. And this, I think, was also a signal to Patriot leaders about not just that Jews were trustworthy or that they could be citizens, but they were also sort of patriots, that they embraced the cause and saw themselves as, we are Jewish Americans and we are going to defend America, and this is our religious institution. I want to say, if I can say a quick word about Chaim Solomon. I ran across a great quote from, I think, the 1950s. There was a Jewish physicist named Arno Penzias, and he says, when he was growing up, he said, he's grown up in 1930s New York, and of course, for the revolution, the teachers broke down all the revolutionary leaders into their ethnic groups, and he says, and the Jews got Chaim Solomon, the banker, which didn't exactly crack Jewish stereotypes. But Chaim Solomon is a financier. He's also a spy. When he's captured by the British, he works as a spy in occupied New York. But there are also a lot of Jews who actually fought on the battlefield or sort of led patriot organizations. I mentioned Mordecai Sheftall in Savannah. There's a guy named Solomon Bush in Pennsylvania who serves with Washington at the Battle of Brandywine. He's wounded in the leg. He hides out. The British capture him, and he's put under house arrest, where he turns into a spy and then is later writing to Washington what he hears the British officers saying and forwarding that along. And there are a number of other of these sort of stories, but even more impressive to me are the times when you can see Judaism in just the average muster rolls. There's a guy serving in the defense of New York who asks for Friday evenings off for Shabbat. And they say, you don't have to serve, you're going to serve the other nights on watch, but you don't have to serve on Shabbat. There are notes about one of the medics at Valley Forge is Jewish, and it just occurs sort of randomly in this one guy's writing that this guy is a devout Jew who is spending his, freezing to death in the winter trying to keep everybody alive. And Benjamin Rush, the Patriot doctor of Philadelphia, would I think he was the first founding father ever to go to bar mitzvah. But he does, and he says he thinks the Jews in all the states were patriots, and that was a very telling story by him.
So you've talked about synagogues in 4 of the 5 major hubs. What about their religious practices? Did they share? Was there a common liturgy at that time? Were they praying in English? Were they praying in Hebrew? Were they doing one or the other? Both?
Many of them were praying in Spanish, oddly enough, because, of course, a lot of these Jews are Sephardic in origin, not entirely, but a lot of the first Jewish immigrants to British North America are Sephardic, and they sort of set things up. They're probably not worshiping with the same liturgy, which probably, and again, it's figuring out liturgy is tough for a historian. It's fun. It's really fun. I love doing it, but it's tough because, of course, liturgy is something people do and not something they don't write. You write down what the service is, but you don't write down, hey, and we were supposed to all stand for this prayer, but nobody does it, that kind of thing. Most Jews, if they have a Maxwell House Haggadah somewhere in their house, they've marked down the parts they're going to keep and the parts they're not. That's liturgy. But they probably didn't all have the same liturgy. Some of them did it in Hebrew. Some of them did it in Spanish. That probably opened the way around the time of the Revolution, when these all come together. What is a common language we can worship in is English. So English actually probably over the course of the Revolutionary War and just after becomes more common as a language of worship. And actually in the decades following the war, there's actually going to be a push for more English in services. And this is well before the reform movement. But this idea of, well, what's really important is that we all understand what it is we're saying. But originally, there's this idea of, we can't really understand what we're talking about. Let's all converse and work in a language that everybody's using, which is, at the time, English. So I think that's, and of course, the other important thing is there's no rabbis in all of America. Rabbinical schools are no rabbinical schools anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And while there were some synagogues in wealthier parts, in the Caribbean, for example, there are some synagogues that are able to pull rabbis in. None of the ones in British North America can offer anything like a competitive salary for someone to come over from Europe. So they're all being led by lay people, by non-professionals. And therefore, the liturgy is kind of all over the place, right? There isn't and this is sort of a challenge of early Judaism, which is to say, there isn't one rabbi giving his interpretation of the Talmud and the Halakha and all of this Jewish tradition is not being funneled through him. It's being funneled through several different people who are just doing the best they can. There's one of the guys, Moses Satius, who's one of the guys in Newport, brother of Gershom. They made him head of their leader of their synagogue, and he has read some of the Shulchan Aruch, and he's read the prayer book, and he's trying his best to figure out what the rules are from there. So it's really, there was probably a lot of diversity. There are, as you might expect, a lot of fights over the liturgy. But it really is sort of a time of real dynamism and change, just because the concept of tradition isn't getting passed along here. It's a change in Judaism as well as a change in the American law.
So we're very well organized today, but 3 centuries ago, not so. So did these Jewish communities have contact with each other?
Yeah. In fact, the important thing, to me, the important thing is, so you've got Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. It's formed of all these patriots. In 1782, they reorganized themselves. And actually, they start a petition drive to end certain restrictions on Jewish office holding in Pennsylvania. They're aware of their civic rights. They're working together. After 1784, the Jews begin to leave Philadelphia and head back home. Every American synagogue by 1790, every American synagogue in the U.S. is being led by someone who had been at Mikveh Israel. So there's a great deal of cantankerous arguments over what Judaism is. And yet there's this sort of institutional link, which is they had all worked together. They had all been part of this Patriot synagogue. So in a sense, what holds together the early synagogues, we might say, is that connection back to the revolution, the fact that they all fought for patriotism and they believe in a civic definition of what a Jew is and what an American is. And that's part of the reason why, in Philadelphia, they have terrible fights. There's a guy named Jonas Phillips who they make him president of the synagogue, and then he resigns, but he refuses to return the deed of the synagogue. He hides it for like 10 years. But they don't kick this guy out. He never leaves the synagogue, because Jonas Phillips is also one of these guys who's petitioning the U.S. government, the Pennsylvania government, and what's called a test oath for office holders. He's petitioning them to say, if someone's elected, they don't need to take a religious oath to enter office, and he's actually successful in that. So again, it is a place where surprise, surprise, Jews are arguing about what they should do in synagogue, but they also have this institutional bond that in some ways makes them a very national religion at a time when most Christian organizations, most Protestant organizations are still regional in character. There's still Virginia Baptists versus Massachusetts Baptists versus Connecticut Baptists. But American Jews have begun to sort of build a national series of Jewish organizations. It's not like B'nai B'rith. It's not like that. But there are important connections between these synagogues, to say nothing of the fact that, of course, when you get all of the Patriot Jews together, it's probably no easier to find a Jewish spouse back then than some people in Idaho have today. You get all these people together. There are a lot of marriages that take place. Women from Savannah marry people from Philadelphia. Men from Newport are marrying women from Richmond and from North Carolina. And you have these family connections that are also built in there.
Taking New York City as an example, how were the Jews treated under British law during this era? And does this have any connection at all with why many Jewish individuals sympathized or supported the rebellion against George III?
I think it does. Jews are not originally supposed to be in New York City is not the first place in the New World that Jewish refugees from Europe are looking for. They actually want to go first to Dutch. Brazil was in charge of, they want to go to Dutch Brazil. And when Brazil gets knocked over by the Portuguese, that's when, the first shipload of Jews sort of heads up to New York City, where Peter Stuyvesant tries to have them kicked out. Jews and I think this is an important point. Jews are living in New York, although New York doesn't really become the center of American Jewish life, probably until I would say the early 19th century, but doesn't matter. Jews are living in New York for a long time, at least from 1700 on. They appear to have gotten some rights there already that they didn't have in England. There are some indications that they probably served in the militia, and some indications that they might even have been voting. But then there is a contested election in the middle of the 18th century, and the argument is put forward, but Jews voted in this election. We don't know how many Jews actually voted in the election. They don't. There's no. The rolls aren't. They don't. The rolls don't exist anymore. But what we do know is, after that point, Jews are forbidden to vote. They cannot hold public office, which means they cannot hold. Not only can they not be councilmen, but they also can't be justices of the peace. They can't be lawyers, for example. So they're in a very restricted position, and they're unequal. They're unequal because of their religion. And again, this is New York in the 18th century. There's lots of inequality. It's not. The Jews are certainly not the only. Slavery is still legal in New York City. It's not a place of equality. But what I think is significant is that Jews have been deliberately reduced in their civic character, and they see this opportunity. They see the rebellion as a chance to not just improve their own position, but to actually have the society around them rethink what makes legitimacy. In a monarchical system, in the end, power goes down to the monarch. One simply has to, and the aristocracy, one simply has to have the right blood. And what the Patriots are saying in some way is, ultimately, it's not your bloodline that counts or your church that counts, but your humanness. And it's going to obviously, it takes a very, very long time for America to live up to that standard. But Jews are but if we look at the revolution and we say, are there people here who didn't have rights as human beings before the revolution who get them after the revolution? There is one case where it happens almost immediately, and that's with American Jews. And I think that's important for American Jews, but it's also, I think, important for how we think about the revolution as a nation, because there are some people who will claim, well, the revolution didn't change anything, and of course, because in many ways the revolution doesn't hit its goals of human equality for decades, centuries, the revolution is not really that revolutionary. But I do think, in terms of religious freedom, you actually get an increase of freedom. There's more freedom after the revolution, right after the revolution, than there is before the revolution. And that, I do think, goes to talking, when we talk about the revolution and freedom, it isn't just a bunch of nonsense. Well, by which I can say the revolution was serious about rethinking where political power comes from, where authority comes from, where legitimacy comes from. And it begins to break down those barriers almost immediately. That doesn't change the fact that inequality, continues in America. But it does mean that I think there is a lesson there in the revolution that we can take to heart, to say, if we dedicate ourselves to the idea that all men are created equal, that might not be such a bad way to do it. And that might be something that also has a track record, even very early on. Even in a society where inequalities were rife, there is this small shift.
Well, we can't have this conversation without mentioning the George Washington letter. You've referenced Moises Seixas, the historic letter, the Newport Congregation letter that was written by George Washington in response to the letter sent to him by the congregation. I believe Seixas was the president or the chairman of the congregation. How do you think? I mean, it's very hard for us to transpose from 2024 to 1790. When I think today, and we are looking, for example, at this pogrom in Amsterdam, as we're talking early in November of this year, we think about protecting Jews, with the statements by public officials, how law enforcement responds to these things, preventive action. Here comes a letter which basically says, hey, listen, and there were 3,000, 4,000 Jews in the country?
Very small.
Don't worry. We've got your back. I mean, I don't mean to be simplistic about it. Is that how this was seen? Was this a revolutionary letter in a revolutionary time?
I think, yes, I hate it when my students say, well, yes and no. It is revolutionary. I think we need to recognize that the decision to include Jews as part of the body politic in the 1780s and 1790s, right after the revolution, that's a big deal. And again, Washington and Seixas sort of really hammer this out in their letters. But again, where Washington sort of says, it is now no more that mere toleration is spoken of, as though one person, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, as though one person gets his rights through the tolerance of another. We have the right to worship as we wish, as long as we demean ourselves as good citizens. And that is not something that someone has to give to us. That is something people have as a right that they are born with and that the United States is going to defend. And Washington says this is just the way we want it, and this will lead to a world where everyone can sort of sit beneath their vine and fig tree. And what's interesting about Washington is every single time any minority group, any minority of religion writes to him, he has something similar to say to them. When the Baptists write to him, he says, can't wait to defend your rights. When the Catholics write to him, he has very wonderful things to say. We're so glad that anyone can be a member of our great governmental machine. When the Swedenborgians, or there are not too many of those around anymore, but they were there back in the day, they write to him. He writes something similar to them. And when we're at the time, larger Christian congregations, Congregationalists or Presbyterians write to him and say, will you please give us your reassurance that you are a Christian and that you run a Christian government? He never gives them a straight answer. He will always say something like, I appeal to the Father of all lights, or the goodness of providence, which is to say, Washington appears to have taken special care to make sure that his government, Washington unquestionably believed in God, unquestionably was a Christian, no doubt in my mind. But as a public official, he makes a lot of effort to demonstrate that the government itself isn't going to be achieving any sort of Christian goals. And then again, there's a much lesser known development in 1800. In 1800, there is a case before the New York State Supreme Court where one of the arguments being made is you can't trust a Jew under oath because all Jews are liars and because they're not going to be bound by a sacred Christian oath. And the person who argues against that view is none other than Alexander Hamilton, who gets up and essentially says, in this government, we do not judge people based on their religion. We don't judge we don't just judge trustworthiness on what we think of their religious beliefs. We judge it on what they do. If a man gives you reason to think he's untrustworthy, that's evidence. If someone else he is related to or is a co-religionist with is untrustworthy, that's a different matter. And Hamilton wins. These are the kinds of really remarkable changes that sort of take place very quietly between 1780 and around 1800 that are, they're happening here and they don't happen in Europe for a fairly long time. And I think what you ultimately get is not just a statement of Jews are going to be protected here, but rather we are all citizens and everyone has that right to worship the way they see fit. And in responding to anti-Semitism in America, which is, a hobby for every Jewish organization these days, sadly. But one thing I always want to sort of stress is that anti-Semitism and fighting for Jewish freedom of worship and Jewish citizenship isn't just because we like the Jews. It's the same for everyone. If Jews can't worship freely and securely, then really nobody can. And that's an old lesson, I think, in the United States. This is the kind of thing that civil rights leaders were talking about for decades. And again, I think the seed of it is there in the revolution. This idea that it's not religious difference that produces a social need to protect a minority. It's not their difference, it's their sameness. It's the fact that we are all of us citizens of the United States, and that's a note we should be hitting. And it sure doesn't hurt that Washington and Jefferson are right in our corner on that one.
Well, it sounds like that's what you would like the takeaway to be for those who read your book.
I hope so. And if they learn about the first use of the word schmooze in English, that's an added benefit that's buried in there too. But yeah, I mean, I think this was a project about how, why I think the revolution is worth studying, why it's worth understanding, and how it can actually still be something that can guide Americans, not in a aren't the Patriots great? Let's dress up and play pretend kind of way. Not where some people want to celebrate the revolution but don't want to know what the revolutionaries actually did. I think we can learn by studying what they did and really thinking hard about it. And I still think that there is something worth following and believing in there. I think particularly for Jewish Americans, but also again, it's not our difference. It's for everybody.
Well, the book is A Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom by Professor Adam Jortner and published by Oxford University Press. It's available now wherever you purchase books. Adam, thank you again for detailing life for Jewish Americans in the era of the American Revolution and their patriotic contribution to a young nation. It's been great speaking with you and wishing you continued success with the book.
Thanks, Dan. It's been my pleasure. Thanks.
Well, this wraps up another episode of Conversations with B'nai B'rith. Big thanks to Dr. Adam Jortner for delving into his new book, A Promised Land. And to you, our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share the episode with others and post about it on social media, or just leave us a comment or a rating. For our latest content, and if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook. We'll be back soon with more important discussions on the issues that matter most to the Jewish community and beyond. Until next time, for my guest, Adam Jortner, this is your host, Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone.